Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see a mixture of new and familiar faces in the Zoom room. So I'm excited to talk with you all a little bit about um, implementation science theories, models, and frameworks. Let me see if I can get things going properly here. And of course, get the presentation mode set up right. Which version am I on? Presentation mode or
Perfect mode.
okay. There you go. I don't know what the alternative is, what the word for it is. So yeah, perfect mode that works for me.
Yeah.
So again, great to be with you all today to talk about implementation science theories, models, and frameworks. Just as a brief kind of introduction, just to kind of set the stage, my name is Larry Hearld. I am a faculty member in the Department of Health Services Administration here at UAB. And the one thing I do want to note, I'm an implementation scientist, and I'll say my entry point into implementation science is really from an organizational lens. I was formally trained as an organizational scientist, kind of management. Basically, how do we build, how do we design organizations to take on new innovations such as evidence-based interventions in a healthcare setting. So that's largely the lens through which I see a lot of implementation science and implementation problems. And that'll become, I think, a little more evident with some of the examples that I'll share in today's presentation. So hopefully that just gives you a little bit of an orientation. So my objectives in today's talk, I think, are relatively modest. First, I want to define and distinguish between different implementation science theories, models, and frameworks. And these terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are, in fact, different, at least in my way of thinking. So I would like to first establish some kind of conceptual and definitional clarity around these terms. Second, I want to provide a high-level overview of some commonly used implementation science frameworks and their purpose, typically when used in implementation science studies. And third, my goal is to help make the overview a little more tangible and relevant to all of you. I'm going to provide some examples or illustrations of how these frameworks can be used in different implementation science studies. And finally, I'll conclude by offering some resources for those of you who may be interested in applying some of these to your own research. So let's start by distinguishing between theories, models, and frameworks. A theory can be formally defined as a set of principles or statements that describe a relationship between two or more variables. And the key thing to keep in mind with a theory is that it is primarily useful for its ability to provide a potential explanation for how and why relationships exist. And for that reason, theories are often used to help kind of elucidate the causal mechanisms and really enable us to predict what will happen when we do something. So when we change something, when we introduce something, what's the impact of doing that? A model, on the other hand, is really just a simplified version of some oftentimes more complex phenomenon. And unlike a theory, a model is descriptive. It's not explanatory. But again, in the case of a model, it still oftentimes relates things like variables. And lastly, a framework can be thought of as a structure or a system of descriptive categories. And the key word here is descriptive. And because of this, frameworks do not provide explanations. They simply organize things. We know we have a lot of things out there in the sort of organizational and social world, and frameworks help us sort of organize all those different concepts and constructs into different buckets. And I think that'll become a little clearer as we work through some of these examples. So we'll kind of work through a couple, see if we can't make these distinctions even more concrete. So we'll start with a well-known framework that I suspect many, if not all of you, are familiar with, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, also known as CFIR. And most of you know that this framework consists of 5 major domains. You have the outer setting, the inner setting, process domain, characteristics of individuals, and characteristics of the innovation or the evidence-based intervention itself. So for this illustration, let's focus on 2 of these domains. We'll focus on the outer setting and the inner setting. And as you know, with the CFAR, each of these domains, these or macro domains tend to contain a number of micro domains or constructs. So for example, the outer setting includes things like patient needs, peer pressure, external policies and incentives, and so forth. And likewise, the inner setting consists of things like the implementation climate, the overall organizational culture, the structure of the organization. So for example, is it hierarchically organized, or is it more flat and decentralized in terms of how it makes decisions? So as this figure is intended to illustrate, the CFAR really just organizes these different features, or what I'm calling microdomains, into really these macro domains of, in this case, outer setting and inner setting. And as a framework, the CFAR doesn't really try to make any suggestions or inferences about how or why these different domains might be related to each other, or even sort of the intervention's effectiveness, right? It's not really saying this is how structure is related to culture. It's just saying these things exist. These are important components of the inner setting, and these are things we need to consider when we're thinking about the organizational context. If we were so inclined, however, we could try and relate these different domains, right? So, for example, we might believe that the outer setting doesn't directly affect the implementation outcomes, but rather it works through or is mediated by the inner setting. So, for example, let's say external incentives or changes in reimbursement for services may not directly affect an intervention's effectiveness, but they may alter the implementation climate in ways that result in better adherence to the intervention and subsequently better outcomes. In this case, in this example, adherence to ART guidelines. Now, important to note here that as a model, it suggests a relationship between these things, but the reason why these things are related is still not made clear. And for that, we really need a theory to be able to explain why it is outer setting is associated with inner setting, or in this case, external incentives might be associated with the implementation climate, which in turn might be associated with greater adherence. So kind of building on that same figure, a theory, or it could be a set of theories, can help us understand why these things like the outer setting and inner setting and implementation or outcomes are related. So, for example, we know that from a lot of organizational research, that organizations are dependent on and responsive to their resource environment. We know that organizations oftentimes make decisions in somewhat predictable ways about what things to change internally and how to change them based on the resources in their external environment. So things like reimbursement, regulations, government regulations, or competition from other organizations. And these things are summarized in something called resource dependence theory, kind of a classic organizational theory. Likewise, let's say we want to know how the inner setting may affect the implementation outcomes. That is fundamentally a question of how and why. Well, one theory that can help us understand why the inner setting may affect implementation outcomes is the theory of organizational readiness for change. And according to this theory, readiness consists of two dimensions, capacity and motivation. And based on these two dimensions, we might argue or hypothesize that certain aspects of the inner setting, like the organizational culture, improves implementation outcomes because it increases employee motivations to implement the intervention with fidelity. So hopefully you can see here, theories help us understand the causal mechanisms between the concepts that are typically delineated in some model. So in essence, theories really help us fill in the gaps or the arrows that you oftentimes see in these models. So you'll see, if you're like me, a very rudimentary Word document with boxes and arrows. Well, the theories are really what help us understand those arrows. What is it? What's within those arrows that would lead you to believe there is a relationship between those two boxes or those constructs? So now, hopefully you have a little better understanding of what theories, models, and frameworks are and how they differ. I want to talk a little more about the role they oftentimes play in implementation science studies. So this figure was adapted from a book chapter by Per Nilsson. It was also in an article in Implementation Science a number of years ago. Many of you may have seen this. As you can see in this figure, he is distinguished between 5 different categories of theories, models, and frameworks that are used for really 3 general purposes in implementation science study. And don't worry if you don't know these different categories of theories, models, and frameworks. I'm going to explain them a little more in the slides ahead. First, on the left-hand side, you have process models, which are generally used to describe or guide the process of translating research into practice. In the middle, you have determinant frameworks, classic theories, and implementation theories, which are typically used to kind of understand or explain what influences implementation outcomes. As I said in the previous slide, theories are really fundamental to unpacking these questions of how and why things are related, or why when you introduce some intervention, you get the outcomes that you desire, or when you introduce an implementation strategy, you get better some implementation outcome of interest. And then finally, on the right-hand side, you have evaluation frameworks, which, as the name suggests, are used to evaluate implementation efforts. So, as noted before, process models are typically used to describe or guide the process of translating research into practice. Some of the commonly used process models in the implementation science literature include the knowledge to action model, and some of you may be familiar with different quality improvement frameworks like PDSA cycles. Those are examples of process models. These also include stage-based models or frameworks like the exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment framework, also known as EPIS, as well as the stages of implementation completion that all of you will become familiar with as you work on your outcomes framework or crosswalk, because that is kind of a component part of the crosswalk. And the idea behind these models is that you can link certain steps together over time to illustrate how things kind of progress. So down here, I've kind of listed a sample aim that you might think of when using a process model. So for example, you might have an aim that says something like, to assess whether stakeholder perceptions of acceptability and feasibility of some intervention or some implementation strategy differs by stage of implementation. So does acceptability improve as you move out of the pre-implementation stage into the implementation stage? As I mentioned before, determinant frameworks describe. They identify factors, both facilitators and barriers, that influence things like implementation strategies and implementation outcomes. Some common determinant frameworks in the implementation science literature are the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, CFIR, the Promoting Action on Research, Implementation, and Health Services, also known as PARIS, and even the Ecological Framework that some of you may be familiar with. And I've denoted with asterisks the ones with established and a growing list of validated measurement instruments, which in many ways I think accounts for their popularity. So CFAR, there's a growing number of established and validated instruments, likewise with PARIS and even the Theoretical Domains Framework. Again, I've listed a couple of sample aims you might think of when using a determinant framework. So for example, you might have an aim to determine the barriers and facilitators of using some intervention from the perspective of diverse stakeholders. Or you might more generally have an aim that says to assess the contextual factors of the intervention settings that influence utilization and dissemination of some intervention. Now, classic theories are those theories that typically originate from fields outside of implementation science. Some of the classic theories you might see used include social cognitive theory, the theory of planned behavior is another one. There are also a wide range of organizational theories and even social network theories that I think are applicable to implementation science studies. These are probably used less so than some of the determinant frameworks and even some of the implementation theories that I'll mention next. But I do think they are applicable and useful for many implementation science topics. Some illustrative aims that might be used with classic theories include to evaluate how local communication networks influence the diffusion or dissemination of some intervention, or to assess how network centrality and density affects the spread of some intervention of interest. Implementation theories are a lot like classic theories, except that they have originated within the implementation science field, and they are developed or have been modified by implementation researchers. Some commonly used implementation theories that you may have encountered or likely will include Rogers' theory of innovations, as well as the normalization process theory. So an example of an aim that might include implementation theories, in this case, normalization process theory specifically, to identify the types of changes and work processes needed to sustain some intervention in primary care clinics, for example. So finally, we have evaluation frameworks, which, as I mentioned before, are used to specify aspects of implementation to be evaluated to determine whether the implementation of some intervention was successful or not. Some of the more commonly used evaluation frameworks in the implementation science literature include the RE-AIM framework, the Precede-Proceed model, and the Proctor Outcomes framework. Again, some illustrative aims are listed here that might use these frameworks. So, for instance, you might have an aim that is intended to compare the clinical effectiveness and maintenance of video-based visits versus site visits for the delivery of care to cardiometabolic patients. So It's worth noting here that these theories, models, and frameworks can be mapped onto logic models that are increasingly seen and sometimes even expected in implementation science grant proposals. As some of you may know, a logic model is simply a description, often graphical, of the hypothesized chain of events leading to an outcome of interest. So in essence, logic models help us unpack the if-then relationships between various elements leading to some outcomes of interest. So here I illustrate one way how you could think about how and where frameworks, theories, and models might be used in conjunction with your logic model, or at least this is how I think of it. So for me, process models really help provide kind of an overarching roadmap that links the different study aims. And I think this is especially important for complex studies with aims that span the implementation spectrum from kind of contextual determinants all the way over here to, say, clinical and patient outcomes. Likewise, I think process outcomes or process models are oftentimes beneficial when linking grants together. So I see people use process models and frameworks to think about how a career development award application might be used as a platform for subsequent R series, like an R01, that might go on to test an intervention that was developed as a part of a career development award. And a process model can kind of help link those together. So think about, again, the EPIS framework: exploration, preparation, implementation, sustainment. When you start thinking about those different components, to really fully address that full model, that's going to take a lot of different studies. So determinant frameworks are particularly helpful in organizing the context in which interventions and implementation strategies are applied. Consequently, determinant frameworks are frequently, not exclusively, but frequently used in the early stages of the logic model here over on the left. So for example, many people will use the CFAR to understand what community or organizational factors are believed to support or hinder the use of an evidence-based intervention. And this understanding can then be used to identify and develop implementation strategies to overcome those barriers to implementation. Evaluation frameworks, as I mentioned earlier, are especially helpful in systematically thinking through the outcomes you want to include in your study. This is true for both the intervention and the implementation strategies that you may be examining. You will get a crash course in applying the REAIM evaluation framework when working through the outcomes crosswalk in the upcoming year. I think Robin mentioned that at the start, that this is going to be something we're going to start 2024 with, and that is all based on the REAIM framework. So those of you who aren't familiar with it, you'll learn a lot more about it. But the REAIM framework is a very popular evaluation framework used in the implementation science literature. And finally, classic theories or implementation theories here are especially useful for filling in the gaps in linking different parts of the logic model. So, for example, some logic models will specify the causal mechanisms between implementation strategies and the interventions and the outcomes. And classic theories and implementation theories, because they help us understand how and why things are related, they are really ideally suited to unpack these kinds of causal mechanisms linking these things together. So this is really just one illustration of how these frameworks, theories, and models might fit with your logic model. By no means is it the only way. You can use, for example, process models in a much more focused way within one of these steps. Likewise, If you've read some of the original article on logic models, you know that these logic models can take different forms, can be assembled in different ways. So this is just kind of one illustration of how you might think these things fit together. So let me conclude this portion of the presentation with a kind of a few takeaways. First, I think it's important to think of theories, models, and frameworks as a guide for your research and not as a straitjacket. One of the primary value adds of theories, models, and frameworks, at least to me, is to help you think systematically about the things you need to consider in your research, whether it is determinants as inputs or factors bearing on your intervention or outcomes to be evaluated. I sometimes see people twisting themselves in knots, trying to either fit a framework or a model to their topic or vice versa. You don't have to adhere dogmatically to a particular framework or theory. It may be that certain aspects of the framework or model are not pertinent to your study. And if that's the case, don't include it. You don't necessarily need to adopt these frameworks wholesale and force fit everything. I see this a lot with some frameworks in particular, like the REAIM framework, where people think that if they are using REAIM, they have to have a measure for each and every domain. And for me, I don't think that's true. I think you need to pick and choose those parts of the framework that are most relevant for the research questions or the aims that you're trying to address in your particular project. And you use that framework to kind of think through what is relevant, but don't force it. Second, we know that no single theory, framework, or model is the best. Many of us have our own preferred frameworks, but all of them have strengths and weaknesses. Your choice of a framework or theory should ultimately be driven first and foremost by the aims. It always starts with the aims of the research question. If you are doing some open-ended exploration, then a determinant framework is likely appropriate. I like to use process models to provide an overarching design, as I mentioned before. Another consideration when thinking about which framework works best for you is to consider what measurement instruments exist. I tend to prefer frameworks where pre-existing and preferably validated instruments exist. The last thing to take away from these initial remarks is that you have a lot of frameworks, theories, and models at your disposal. And you may need more than one, especially if the scope of your project is large. So let me kind of conclude the presentation with a couple of examples that hopefully will kind of illustrate these ideas a little better for you all. So the first example I'm going to talk about is a recently completed PCORI-funded implementation study that examined whether a set of standardized and customized implementation strategies could facilitate the implementation of a shared decision-making aid for patients with lupus, and how the contextual characteristics or circumstances of 15 participating clinics in the study may influence the use of those implementation strategies. In this case, the study adopted a mixed method observational case study design. And the reason for using that particular design was in part due to the recognition that the contextual circumstances for each of the 15 clinics that were participating would likely have important implications for the strategies that were ultimately adopted, as well as their ability to deploy these strategies. In this case, we used 3 different frameworks across different stages and aims of the study. The first aim was a formative assessment of stakeholder needs and the contextual circumstances of the 15 clinics that were participating in the study. And this aim used CFAR and the theory of organizational readiness to implement change as the guiding kind of frameworks and theories. The second aim was really kind of the heart of the study, where the implementation strategies were put into action. And here we used Powell's typology of implementation strategies, which subsequently became kind of a part of the ERIC compendium, which you can really think of, at least in my view, as kind of a determinant framework. And we also used Proctor's outcome framework to define our outcomes for aim 2. And the third aim focused on sustainability. And in this case, we didn't really use any particular framework, although it was in fact encompassed by Proctor's outcome framework. So this figure just kind of illustrates what I noted on the previous slide. We used a multitude of different frameworks. Over here, as I said before, aim 1 was really kind of a planning formative aim where we use CFAR and the theory of organizational readiness to implement change. Some of our constructs in our surveys and our interviews also drew upon the organizational learning literature. So to what extent do these clinics sort of engage in quality improvement, and where do they get ideas to make changes in their clinic? Likewise, we drew from the literature on psychological safety. So we even had some classic theories as a part of this first aim. Moving into the second aim, this is where we also drew upon CFAR as well as this typology of implementation strategies. And then moving over here to the third aim, as I said before, we didn't really have a formal framework here, but we did our measures of sustainability certainly fit within Proctor's outcome framework, not Powell's outcome framework. So let me show you another example that may resonate more with all of you working in the HIV space. This is a study named Coastal. It is a type 2 hybrid effectiveness implementation study that is examining how to adapt and integrate a multi-component intervention in a local health department in Mobile, Alabama. Secondly, the goal is to kind of assess its impact on clinical and implementation outcomes. And thirdly, our goal is to identify appropriate and feasible implementation strategies for future testing. And those are kind of described in the 3 aims here. So this is a project that is currently underway. I think we're in our second year, maybe second or third year. The PI is one of the consultants here with the UAB Implementation Science Hub, Adiarana. And I think others maybe on the call are also involved in this project as well. So here the aims are overlaid onto one version of our logic model. We've gone through multiple iterations of this logic model. So here's the one that I'm going with for this presentation. As I noted before, I haven't noted this before, but we are using CFAR to understand how contextual factors may need to be considered when adapting our 3-component intervention. And while we didn't specify this in the proposal itself, one question you could ask yourself is why these contextual factors may influence the need to adapt the intervention here in this. So in this case, again, we could use, for example, resource dependence theory, which again comes out of the organization science literature. That might help explain why some of these organizational conditions may create a need to adapt the intervention in certain ways. We are using REAIM as our evaluation framework to think about the outcomes to consider. In this case, the question to ask is, why might the intervention, these three different intervention components, produce these outcomes of interest over here? What is the underlying mechanism that would lead something like community-based testing or linkage to care to better fidelity and ultimately fewer days to viral suppression? In this case, we might consider something like attention theory, which also comes out of the organizational management literature. That might work particularly well in this case for the community-based testing component. And we might consider something like normalization process theory for the linkage to care in the ART components. Again, we didn't specify these in the proposal in this case because there's only limited space, as all of you know, in any kind of proposal like this. So I'm really kind of theorizing on the fly here, but you kind of get the idea of where these theories might fit in a rather busy logic model such as the one I'm showing you here. And finally, although this is identified as future work, another question to be considered would be why the selected implementation strategies might influence the uptake of the three-component intervention. In this case, we might use something like the theory of organizational readiness for change and argue that things like educational strategies, improve the motivation to use the intervention, while something like process redesign improves local health department capacity to take on the intervention, just as a couple of examples. So I'll conclude by providing a few resources for those of you who are interested in learning more about implementation science models and frameworks. First, I provided a couple of references for articles that I think provide good overviews of the different types of models and frameworks and how they can be applied. This is the article I mentioned before by Per Nilsson that really kind of defines and distinguishes between different types of theories, models, and frameworks. And then at the bottom here, I've highlighted a couple of web-based resources that might be helpful for you in selecting a particular theory, model, or framework for your own research. I think this is one of the bigger challenges, especially for those of you new to implementation science, is just knowing where to begin to narrow down the list. There are, I don't know if I'm exaggerating here, but there are countless, not countless, but probably approaching over 100 different theories, models, and frameworks that are available out there, particularly if you kind of expand beyond the implementation science literature specifically. So how you begin to make sense of all those frameworks and make a decision about which ones make the most sense for your research can be a really daunting challenge for those of you new to the field. So these resources will hopefully give you an entry point and some tools for helping narrow that list. Again, not an exhaustive list of resources, but again, hopefully they help you begin to navigate this rather busy and growing literature. So with that, I'm going to stop the presentation here and open it up to any questions for folks who have stuck with us this long.
Hi, this is Ingrid Bassett. I'm from Boston. I have a question. Thanks for this talk. I have heard talks about theories, models, and frameworks before, but I really liked the way you distinguished between them and kind of talked about where they're useful as you're thinking about kind of the life cycle of a project. So thanks for that. I just wondered, how you relate this to the kind of required EHE implementation research logic model that, is part of the notice of special interest, which to me seems kind of like a mashup of many different things. And how you advise people who are applying for these grants, like how do you fit all of, how do you make it fit to what's specific to your intervention? And then my sort of follow-up question is, I do find that there's only so much space. And so there's also the risk of like introducing all these different concepts. And I find sometimes the reviewers get, angry. So this is really grantsmanship questions. But I really appreciate the way you set this up and presented. It was very clear. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there any other kind of reviewer than an angry one? That's all joking aside. Yeah, I agree. I'll start with the second part. You do have to be cautious in terms of what gets presented in these logic models. It's easy to put too much in them, and in many cases, I do think less is more. When I'm sort of either I'm working with other collaborators and starting to think through the the aims and how they fit together and the outcomes that we're interested in, I do tend to start with a very comprehensive logic model, kind of like the one I showed you here with the coastal project. I mean, that's a rather extensive one, and I can tell you that is not the one that ultimately went in the grant proposal. We used a pared down one because one, it's just kind of too much. And secondly, like you said, I mean, sometimes if you include things the in the logic model that is not like an explicit part of the proposed work, like it's going to be done in future work, that's where I've seen applicants get critiqued, because it's either confusing for reviewers or it just it raises more questions than it answers. So I do find I do think these logic models are useful for planning purposes and even as a project team for coordination purposes, but my advice would be to start comprehensive, but as you work towards the submission to narrow it down to focus only on those essential pieces that align with your proposed aims. Related to that, I think in reality, even though I spent a fair amount of time talking about theories as a part of this presentation, in many cases, formal theories I don't find are oftentimes included in the grant proposals itself. These underlying mechanisms you're starting to see in the implementation science literature more calls for researchers to pay attention to the mechanisms, the causal mechanisms, for instance, by which implementation strategies may improve uptake or may improve fidelity. But my own take on the literature is that right now those are just that. They're kind of calls for researchers to do more in the vein of explicating and testing some of these mechanisms, but thus far, empirically, researchers have not taken that up. So as a result of that, what I think you often see in grant proposals is an emphasis or a use of models and frameworks and less of a emphasis on some of the formal theories that I may have mentioned. Those tend to get included after the fact, when you're writing up manuscripts and things like that, and you're maybe, for me, I publish more a lot in kind of healthcare management, health services, general health services research journals, where they tend to be very hypothesis driven, in which case, oftentimes you need a good theory to ground those hypotheses. So at that point in time is where I oftentimes will turn to more of the formal theories. So that's a bit of a meandering response to your question, and now I'm at the end of it. I'm not sure I fully answered the question. So if I didn't, feel free to
that was a
ask
good
again.
answer. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? I know theory, it's one of those things that I think it's not always the most exciting part of any kind of study, but I do think it's important. So it doesn't always generate a lot of enthusiasm and questions, but yeah. Don't see any other takers. Nothing in the chat that I can see.
I did get an individual question about whether we would be sharing the recording and the slides. And yes, we will, for our projects, we have a box folder and be sharing it there. And also we'll be uploading the recording to our YouTube channel for this UAV CFAR. So look forward to sharing that out here soon.
Well, if there aren't any questions now, you're certainly welcome to reach out. As Robin said, we'll make the slides available, the recording available, and you're more than welcome to reach out at any later time if you have questions or you want to chat about your theory model or framework or logic models, as we kind of the question kind of indicated, are becoming a little more and more, I think, commonly used, particularly in the supplements and a lot of the EHE proposals. So I seem to get a lot of questions on logic models and how to construct those and present those. So as you get into your projects or future work and some of these questions come up, you're certainly more than welcome to reach out at that point in time as well.
Great job, Larry, as always. Thank you so much. That was always a master lecture.
All right, well, if we don't have anything else, we'll let everyone get on with their day. Good seeing you all, and hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.